I was also thinking this week about Brother Al. And you never know what kind of influences people will have in your lives. But I remember having conversations with Brother Al about sermons and the idea of length of sermons and what was an appropriate length. And some are a little bit longer than most expect. Some can be right on point where the audience, that's what I expected out of the preacher. And then there are some that might be a little bit shorter. And I got to thinking about that, and I was sharing that with my family because this week's lesson, because it is the second half of what we're looking at, is going to be a little bit shorter. But it's going to cover what it needs. And the one thing that Al always told me when we talked about the idea of length is, he said it needs to be long enough to cover what you have to say and be done. You don't need to be redundant. Just share what needs to be said and be done. And what needs to be said is what the scriptures say about the answer to who Jesus Christ is. And that's what we want to look at. And I want to start out reading once again at verse 27 of Mark chapter 8. Now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, "Who do men say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." Then he charged them that they should tell no one about him. And so last week we looked at what he didn't ask. And there were several things we talked about that Christ could have asked his disciples. But when you're trying to get information from someone and you're doing it through asking questions, as the person asking the questions, you can kind of lead your audience where you want them to go. And that's exactly what Christ is doing here. And so he asked them the question last week. We looked at, who do men say that I am? Right? It was a broad spectrum question. What are you hearing? Who are people claiming that Jesus Christ is? And that's where we left off. He gives this generic question. And we talked about it's a question that we can also consider today as well, right? It's important to recognize who Jesus Christ is. So he asks this broad question, but in the first part of verse 29, he says to them, he gives them a but. But who do you say that I am? We've gone from broad, well, people are saying this, or people are saying this, or people are saying this. He says, okay, but who is it that you are saying that I am? It's now personal. He's asking them individually. He's not asking them what others are saying. He's asking in contrast to the popular opinion that exists, in contrast to what others are saying, who do you say that I am? And you know, it's the same today. There's that same question today. Because when Christ asks the question, or it comes to me, if it comes to me, and it says, who do you say that I am? And I say, well, Gerald says this is who Christ is, and Doug says this is who Christ is, and then, you know, somebody else says, well, this is who Christ is. Do their beliefs and do their words stand for me when it comes time to answer that question? When Christ asks me, if he were to ask me at judgment, who do you say that I am? And I answered who other people say. Does the fact that Gerald can say Jesus is the Son of God make it okay for me if I don't answer it for me personally? It's an individual question, isn't it? It comes down to, who do you say that I am? So there is a personal accountability. Each one of us is accountable to answer that question. And based on that question, we all understand, we get the rewards of what it is. Either we gain the result of, yes, you got it right, or no, you didn't. And then there are the consequences on both sides. And again, we think of consequences generally in a negative sense. But consequences are simply the results of something. So you can have a positive consequence by getting the answer right. or you can have that negative consequence. But it comes down to me individually. And when he asked this question, granted, we know that one spoke for them, which is pretty typical of Peter. We understand Peter has a tendency to be the first to jump. He has the tendency to be the first to speak. But the question wasn't just meant for Peter, was it? Do you think he was specifically asking Peter that question? We know that's not the case, and how do we know that? Because when he asks his first question, he gets answers from different disciples, doesn't he? It doesn't specify who's responding to the question. Just gives them that some are saying these various things. I need to recognize, again, that another's confession is not going to help me. You know, as parents, that might be one of the hardest things to consider if your child hasn't yet made the decision to become a member of the Lord's church. That child's not going to be able to stand before God and say, well, my mom and dad believed that Jesus was the Son of God, and so they acted upon it. And you have to come down to part of believing who Jesus is. If you believe who he is, then you will do what he says. Right? We do the things we do because of who Jesus is, but it's because we believe him. And so that belief will lead us to individual action. It doesn't matter what others thought. Jesus was concerned with what each individual had to say. And it was important. And do you see, again, as a teaching tool, because Christ is always teaching, and to add this in as a bonus, see how he does it. Did Christ set up the whole situation based on how he asked the questions? He started with the broad sense, right? Ultimately, what was he looking to get to, though? He was looking to get them to the fact that they need to recognize individual accountability. That's where he was leading them. Most of the world today, the popular view is that they reject who Christ is based on being the Son of God. They may say he was a good man. They may say he was a good teacher. Some may say he didn't exist at all. But even those that say he's a good man, they reject who he truly is. And we get the answer, and we'll get to the answer of who he truly is in just a moment. We need to recognize, though, and we need to be thankful for the fact that he forgives and he will pardon those who accept him as he really is, confess him as he really is, and do his will. So we have the question, who do you say that I am? Peter is the first to respond, and he says, you are the Christ. That's the answer. There aren't multiple answers. There is one answer. And the answer, and it is exactly what Jesus was looking for, is that he is the Christ. And I want you to think about Peter for just a second. As he responds, he is certain of who Jesus is, and he's not afraid to admit it. How many of us can say that about ourselves? We know who Jesus is, and we're not afraid to let people know, right? I'm afraid there are a lot of people in the world today that profess to be Christians, profess to be followers of Christ, but they're afraid to admit it. They're afraid to admit it. And when you study Scripture and you look at what the Word of God has to say, there is an expectation that we are to confess before men who he is. And if we don't do that, then we're not doing one of his commands. We're not doing, you'll see I have a sermon that's going online or maybe online on great expectations. There's an expectation that we not only accept and do his will, but that we tell others. And that we're not afraid. That we can be quick to answer with no doubt in our mind. There was no doubt that Christ was the Messiah, the anointed one of God, the one that was to come that had been prophesied of before. He recognized Jesus wasn't just a great prophet or great teacher. He wasn't just one who could perform miracles. He was the Christ. I want you to think about that. Are there people in the world today that believe that individuals can perform miracles. There's a lot of false teachers in the world today, aren't there? Now, maybe we don't see it quite as much as I can remember when I was a little bit younger, but these healing services and these miracle workers that come in and they claim to do certain things, one, they can't do it. We know that. But if you just look at it in terms of if there's a belief that they're able to do that, that's what I'm talking about when I say people could even believe that, yeah, Jesus could perform miracles. They might have even accepted that. There were some great things that he could do, but they don't accept him as the true Son of God. And most of them won't accept that, even despite the fact that they believe he can perform miracles, that he could perform the miracle of being raised from the dead. Peter knows the truth. Peter's not afraid to answer and to confess that truth. We need to be the same way. We need to have the same confidence, and we need to make sure that when we are talking about Jesus, that our focus is that he is the Christ. He is the anointed one, and he is the Son of God, and that's who we're talking about. And if that's who we're talking about, then you better respect him, and you better believe him, right? It's important. Again, his whole emphasis, and we looked at this last week, his whole emphasis and the reason he asks the questions the way he does is because everything he does is based on who he is. His teachings matter because of who he is. The miracles he performed mattered because of who he is. And his commands mattered because of who he is. We talked about you could take out some of the great leaders, religious leaders in other tenets, other belief systems, and you would still have their basic belief systems. But we talked about you can't take Christ out of Christianity. You cannot remove Christ and still have the same teachings, because he made an emphasis and he made a point on making people recognize the reason you must believe is because I am the Son of God, because I am the Christ. And that's the answer. And then we have something that some people might say seems strange. It says that then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. Now, I just mentioned, didn't I, that Christ tells us we have a responsibility to go out and to teach, right? Well, this says, but he just told them and he warned them, don't tell anybody who I am. That seems strange, doesn't it? Until we take time to study further. Until we look at it, and we'll get our answer as to why. Jesus understands that this is not the time for this particular declaration to be made to the world. We talk about God does everything on his time. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son to be born of a virgin, right? At the right time. Christ recognizes this isn't the right time for this declaration to be made. There would be confusion. If they made this declaration and they went in and said, this is the Messiah, this is who you've been looking for, the Jews were seeking a political Messiah, one who would liberate the people from Rome. They might be confused about who it is that this Jesus is. Declaring Jesus as the Messiah would create false hope and false expectations for the overthrowing of Rome at this point. There are reasons why Christ does and says what he says. And we may not understand fully all the time, right? But here's what you can point out when you are studying this one. Here are some reasons that we can give as to why he might say this. Here's another one. Who's he speaking to at this particular point in time? He's speaking to those disciples, isn't he? When he says, don't do this, he specifically declared that to them. Is that a message for us today? Are there times when Jesus speaks specifically to the people there and what they need to do? And are there times when he specifically speaks to us? And when he speaks to us, what is he telling us to do? That we're to go and we're to do it. And he's saying, tell no one right now. He doesn't say don't ever tell. It's not a matter of don't ever tell. This is a matter of this is not the time. Verse 31, even though it wasn't a part of our original text, 27 through 30, but verse 31 gives us an explanation for that command. In verse 31 it says, "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." So it's not time. These are things that still have to happen. There are things that the Messiah, that the Christ, that the Son of God must go through. And what happens after he's been through all of those things? Then comes the commands to go out and tell everybody, right? But everything done in the right time, on God's terms, on Christ's terms. And so we need to be able to, again, kind of as a side point, we need to be able to explain to people when a command comes up that might not seem to make sense, right? It might not seem to make sense. Here he is saying, don't tell people. You just professed what is true, and you're exactly right. And if we look at other versions of this same situation, we have the great statement that Christ makes that he says, "Upon this rock I will build my church." The very foundation of the church is the statement that you are the Christ, the Son of God. You know, that's exactly what was said at that time. You just have different writers with different perspectives. You know, it's not mentioned in Matthew that he tells them not to say anything, but it's mentioned in Mark, right? And so you have different people that see things and record things based on their perception of what they see. And you know what? The fact that it doesn't say something in one place doesn't mean it didn't happen in another. And you could go through, and again, as a teaching point for people that say, well, look, these things are a little bit different, is go into a room sometime, have several people sit in a room, have something happen in that room that seemed out of the ordinary. I can remember in high school, there was a seating of students before a class, and the teacher hadn't showed up yet. And then a couple of really good friends came into the room, and they started fighting with one another. Teacher came in, hadn't seen anything, and he said, you were all in here, I wasn't. Take out a piece of paper and write down what happened so that I will know what took place. You think there were some differences in what was written down? I guarantee you there was. I was there when this took place. I think there was differences. But did they see the same thing? Yep. So did the fact that there were differences in what was said, if they were giving facts, change the facts? Not at all. Again, teaching points for us to understand. But I really want us to recognize the whole point of this lesson, and we're coming to our conclusion, and we'll be just about to stand up and sing, but our conclusion really comes down to, again, the question being not who do others say that Jesus is. The question for each and every one of us is, who do I say that Jesus is? And the reason it's so important is because your response to that question determines your eternal destiny. So I encourage you, as we close out this morning, to think about who it is that Jesus is, and to think about who you believe him to be, and ask yourself who it is that God says Jesus is,